Good morning, Shabbat Shalom, and welcome to United Israel World Union. This is our Sabbath morning scripture study coming to you live from St. Francisville, Louisiana. Thank you so very much for joining us today. Thank you to those who are here in person, those who are watching on YouTube, those who are watching on Facebook, and get this, today, for the first time ever, whether anybody's there or not, I don't know yet, but we are live streaming to Twitter, to our Twitter account. And for those of you who have Twitter, we've had a Twitter account. United Israel has had a Twitter account for several years and just not really utilized it that much. But because of the way that things go, more and more people are using Twitter. And it's just another way to reach people with our message. So effective earlier this week, I decided that I would begin to be more active on Twitter for those people who follow United Israel through that particular social media platform. What I didn't realize until this morning is, I had no way of knowing this, until a memory popped up on Facebook that it was on this day in 2018, 4 years ago, that we, for the first time, simul-streamed our Saturday morning service to Facebook and YouTube. So it must be something in the spring air that makes me say, it's time to reach another group of people. So again, this day, April the 9th, will go down in history at United Israel because now we're live streaming to those three services. So again, thank you very much for joining us wherever you are. And I don't want to leave out those who will watch this later. In Deuteronomy chapter 29, verse 14, Moses in Torah portion Nitzavim made the comment that his words, the covenant that he communicated that day, were not just to those who were standing there at that time, but to those who were not here with us today. So I would say the same thing, if I might be allowed to take a little bit of liberty and use Moses' words there, and say this message is not only for those who are here with us today, but those who might listen later to an archive of this on video, whether it's on one of these social media platforms or it might be on one of our podcasts. You can find us on Spotify, Pandora, iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, anywhere you get your streaming material. So welcome. Thank you very much. I want to cover today a subject about biblical diets. You hear that S on the end? Biblical diets, more than one diet. The Bible has quite a bit to say. So we're dealing with biblical diets and dietary rules. And people say, well, wait a minute, Ross, I thought we were following the annual cycle of readings, and we've already passed that. Indeed, we have. But last week, I spent a little bit of time explaining the way that I'm grouping the material together. And so last week, I covered what related to Sara'at. You remember the class. It has to do with what is typically translated as leprosy, and we talked a great deal about that. Well, that subject of Sara'at branches into two Torah readings. Last week's Torah reading, which is covered in last week's class, but it also moves into today's, according to the annual cycle of readings, this week's Torah portion would cover Leviticus chapter 14 and 15. Well, I already covered 14 because I did that last week. Chapter 15 is something that I'm not going to cover in my normal cycle of teaching. It covers fluxes and fluids, bodily discharges, and you are welcome to study that. There's a good bit out there on that. In fact, thetorah.com has several articles related to that, and of course the subject of nidah, the purification for women and so forth. But I wanted to go back and pick up a subject that I went past, and it's from chapter 11 of Leviticus. And chapter 11 of Leviticus, as many of you know, covers these are the living things that you can eat. So it has to do with eating. Now, I'm not just going to restrict myself today in the teaching to Leviticus chapter 11. I'm going to cover Leviticus 11, but I thought it would be interesting, and it is, by the way, because I did this in my research this week, to put Leviticus chapter 11 side by side with Deuteronomy 14 and do what we call a horizontal study, where you take two sources from the Pentateuch that cover the same material essentially, and you look at them side by side for comparison and contrast. So when I talk about Leviticus 11, I'm going to use the chart that I put together that I posted on our Facebook group page and on our website. So hopefully you have access to that, and we'll definitely get into that. So I do want to cover Leviticus 11. I do want to cover Deuteronomy chapter 14, but I also want to talk more generally about that which we can and cannot and should not take into our mouth and into our belly according to biblical law. Now, I'm going to focus primarily on the flesh part of that because there are other rules, there are other laws. Now, we're going to talk about diet from the Garden of Eden all the way up through the biblical period, but there are rules that you should know that have to do with fruit as well, right? You know, people go out and they go to their local market or whatever, and they buy a fruit tree and they plant it, and they're so excited when the little plum shows up in year one of the tree's life, and they run out and eat it up. Well, what does the Bible say about that? But that's not what I'm going to get into today. I'll be talking about diets, plural, and food according to the biblical text, primarily animals, okay? We're going to see that diet and food play an essential, an integral part in faith according to the biblical text. In fact, it is even tied and associated with what I might call holy living, H-O-L-Y, holy living. So I'm looking forward to this class. Now, first of all, this is a little bit of a Hebrew lesson for you fine Bible students, and I want to ask you, if you took out a pencil and a piece of paper, please do this wherever you are. And I want you to do one thing for me. I want you to say on the paper, guess what is the most frequently used Hebrew word in all of the Bible. The most frequently used word, okay? Now you might think words like love. You know, a lot of people have this idea. The Bible is just a love letter from God to humans, okay? You might think of law. Maybe law is the most. Now, if I zoom in and I say, let's make it a verb. What's the most frequently used verb in all the Hebrew Bible? You ready? It's achal. It's achal. Let's do it this way. Aleph, Chaf, Lamed. Achal. This word is used, I don't know why the Lamed looks like this. It's kind of like it's a little bit short, but it's the deck of cards that I was dealt, so you have to go with me. I bought these on Amazon. I didn't have a say in that. But here is the most frequently used verb, and I'll tell you that if you get a deck of biblical vocabulary cards and you pick them up, and particularly the good set, most of these sets that I've ever seen are listed by frequency. So, and by form of speech. So you go to the verb sections. My card that is number one in my biblical vocabulary set, you can't see this, but you just have to trust me. I don't know if you can, maybe you can see that, but it's achal. All right? Now, from this word, achal, we get all sorts of derivative words. Cognates, we get other words. Achal is translated as a verb to eat. Now think about that. The most frequently used verb in all the Bible is eat. Now from that we get these other words. We get food, we get feed, we get variations on this card. In fact, on this vocabulary card, it has achal, the verb in the call form, and it gives me 3 derivative words. Ochel, ma'achal, ochla, food, feed, feeds. All these related to the consumption of something. And by the way, for those of you who are able to read Hebrew and you want to really enhance your vocabulary, there's no need to go out and buy a Hebrew vocabulary learning book, because I have one for free up on my academia page. On my academia page, I have a booklet that I put together with my definition of the top most frequently used 1,000 words in the Hebrew Bible. So if you get that 1,000 words down, you can pick up a Hebrew Bible and do pretty well for yourself. You can read along quite easily. So when I think about the frequency with which we encounter food and eating, not only is it a necessary part of our existence, of our livelihood, and so you would expect to find it, but food and eating can be among our greatest joys as humans, right? Think about all the good times and the good foods that we've had with loved ones and so forth. But it can also, food and eating can also present itself as one of our greatest challenges. Can I get an amen? Right? Most of us have at some time or another had to look at what we put into ourselves and said, I think I could lay off of that a little bit, or I could ease up a little bit on that. Or there's the other side of the equation where someone is trying to build weight. I look at my young sons and they all want to get, big, and they want to gain weight. And I'm thinking, just take it as it comes, man. One day you're going to wish you could lose some of that stuff. Just stay skinny for as long as you can, man, whatever. But throughout human history, meals have been associated with the gathering together of family and friends, and they are associated in the ancient world, particularly in the making of covenants between a person and another person, or a party and another party. And those kind of things still go on to this day. Think about the relationships that are built around meals. If a person wants to impress someone that they truly like, they'll take them out on a date, and particularly take them to a nice restaurant. Or in business, when people want to make the deal, they take them out and buy a nice bottle of wine and, some lovely dinner at a fancy restaurant. Food is part of who we are. It's part of what we do. It's part of our relationships and so forth. Good choices associated with diet and food can, and most often, though not always, most often directly relate to longevity or a lengthening of our days. If we make healthy choices, good choices, safe choices, typically that's good for us, and it does our body good. I think there's an old commercial that says that, somebody's slogan. And to a better quality of life, I might add. Bad choices in regards to food and diet can lead to negative consequences and the opposite of, though not always, the lengthening of days and quality of life. Now, because of the central role that diet and food plays in humanity, if you will, we all have to eat something, right? You have to, it's what keeps us going. So because it plays such an important role, you would expect to find within the Bible, with no surprise, certain rules and regulations and parameters which govern that thing. that eating and the food which we take in. So you would expect that because people all over the world have to do this. All right. And so it is in the biblical text. We do find rules and regulations, what we can and cannot, what we should and should not put into our mouths, bapi, into our mouths, and ultimately into our gachon, our belly. All right? Diet and food are central to the Pentateuch story. Now, here's something that I wanted to bring into the class today just because I think it's really cool. Not so much biblical, but it is derived from the biblical text. Now, you've heard people talk about the Masoretic text. The Masoretic text. The Masoretes are scribes. Now, scribe in Hebrew is a sofer, one who counts. And so a scribe, one who counts, and his purpose or her purpose is to accurately reproduce a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy. And one of the practices to verify that is that these scribes have to count. They say prayers, they count words and letters, and they make sure that the line that they just wrote represents identically what they see on the master before them, right? So a person who counts is a scribe, a sofer. And the scribes, the Masoretic scribes, when I open my Hebrew Bible with Masoretic notes, it tells me something interesting, tells me all kind of interesting things. But in Leviticus chapter 11 and verse 42, there is the Hebrew word gachon, which means belly. And in the word gachon is a vav, and the vav, interestingly enough, in the Masoretic text is enlarged. It's larger than the letters around it. There are 17 letters like this in a Torah scroll that are larger or smaller. They're special letters. This is one of those special letters. And the footnote in Hebrew, the Masoretic note that's attached to the vav in the word gachon in Leviticus 11 verse 42, which means belly, is said by the Masoretic scribes to be the center of the Torah. In other words, if you count the letters in a Torah scroll, you will find that there are 304,805 Hebrew letters in the Pentateuch. Now, what that means is that according to those who count, that the center of that 304,805 is the vav in the word gachon, which means belly, in Leviticus chapter 11 and verse 42. Now, what you make of that is up to you. Could it be that one could extrapolate from that the belly is the center of the Torah? Well, you could put together a case if you were teaching a class on food and diet that said it's at least worth bringing up. Now, but if that were the case, first of all, the question is the count accurate? Now, some of you might want to check me on this. Literally, to make this so, the vav in the word gachon, which means belly, in Leviticus 11, verse 42, if that is the middle letter, we ought to be able to split 304,805 right in the middle, and that would be the letter vav. It would need to be letter number, you ready? 152,403. Everybody got that math? You can count. Don't do it now. I want to tell you some things. Just write this stuff down and do it later in your own time. But the math doesn't work. It's not the center of the Torah. I'm sorry, but it just doesn't work. If it were the center letter, it would be number 152,403. If I said it wrong before, I know that's right because I just looked at my notes. But there are 157,236 letters that bring us to the Vav in Gakon in Leviticus 11, verse 42. So, what do we do with that? Did I just waste 3 minutes of your time? Nah, not really. Because there's a rabbi who came up with something pretty interesting. He said, wait a minute. I hear you. You challenged what the Masoretes said, but you didn't understand what they were talking about. They don't mean, says Rabbi Yitzhak Yosef Zilber, they don't mean that that is the dead center if you count all the letters and split it in half. They are telling you that it is the center letter, but it's the center of the 17 special letters, right? So follow me on this. If you have 17 letters that are specially written in a Torah scroll, some larger, some smaller, then you have the center of 17 is letter number 9. You have 8 on one side of it, 8 special letters on the other. The middle one is the Vav in Gakon, which means belly, in Leviticus chapter 11, verse 42. Now, it's close to the center of the Bible. So, again, whatever you make of that, whether you dismiss it, is okay. But the center of everything is really about diet, particularly when we talk about it. It relates to all of us. You know, certain things don't relate to all of humanity. Food and diet is one that does. You might not eat everything that another person eats, but everybody must eat at some point in order to stay alive. The Bible has a lot to say about diet and food. The Bible has a lot to say about what is permissible, allowable, and that which is forbidden. And these rules, the importance and the associated rules with diet go all the way back to the beginning of Scripture. And if we go back all the way to the beginning, to Genesis chapter 1, I'll show you. We're going to work quickly through some text to show the significance, the importance of biblical diet. We'll also introduce something that you might not think about, and that is that diet is multifaceted and it has changed. Biblically, there have been changes in the diet. Now, I know a lot of people want to give you the story that God told Adam all the 613 commandments, and then he taught it to his son Seth in a cave, and then he taught it to this person and that person, because they want to insinuate that everything that is now part of Torah law has always been. But is that what we find in the text? And the answer is no. Genesis chapter 1, verse 29 and 30, God said, "See, I give you every seed-bearing plant that is upon all the earth, and every tree that has seed-bearing fruit, that shall be yours for food. And to all the animals on the land, to all the birds of the sky, to everything that creeps on the earth, in which there is the breath of life, I give all green plants for food." Now, when the Bible begins, every living thing, by the way, a lot of people think that animals or beasts or whatever word they use don't have a soul. You ever heard that? Animals don't have a soul. Only humans have a soul. That's not true. According to the Bible, animals, all living breathers, would include, widely encompassing, humans and animals. Now, someone might make a case that the distinction could be that we humans are created in the image of God, whereas the animals and beasts aren't. But don't say that they don't have a soul if you use the word soul for the Hebrew nephesh. I'm not so sure that's right. Nephesh, as Tabor points out in his book of Genesis, has to do with the throat. It's something to do with the exhaling and inhaling of that which gives us life, the air we breathe. It's a living life breather is what we're talking about. But notice that everything which breathes has the same food. Fruit-bearing, green things there is no meat consumption, there is no animal consumed at this stage. And it can be argued from a biblical and prophetic standpoint that ultimately will be again. So we get images of peace, particularly in Isaiah chapter 11, and then again in Isaiah chapter 65, that they will not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain. You know, the prophetic image that Isaiah and others give us is that the wolf will lie with the lamb, and you'll have a lion eating straw like an ox. You know, that's a prophetic picture. Some say, well, it's not really literally to be taken literally. I don't know. I can tell you now, I wouldn't jump in a lion pen right now and try to give him some straw. I wouldn't test that out. But according to the prophets, this image is that it's a return back to this ideal in Eden. So the original plant-based diet is the only diet known in the garden. Now look down at chapter 2 of Genesis, verse 8 and 9. The Lord God planted a garden in Eden in the east and placed there the man whom he had formed. And from the ground the Lord God caused to grow every tree that was pleasing to the sight and good for food, with the tree of life in the middle of the garden and the tree of knowledge of good and bad. Okay, so you get the idea that God then takes the man that he's created, Adam in Hebrew. It's not a personal name. It's the name of the being that he creates. He takes Adam. He brings Adam and puts Adam in this garden that he has made in the east of Eden. Now look down with me at verse 15. Notice what his purpose is. The Lord God took the man, placed him in the Garden of Eden to till it and tend it. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, of every tree of the garden you may eat, but as for the tree of the knowledge of good and bad, you must not eat of it, for as soon as you eat of it, you shall die. The first thing that God tells man, or in the first communication from God to man, it's that he will be able to eat, and that eating he should do. And he's given him the food that he is to take into his mouth and into his gachon, into his belly, and this sets forth the living experience of man. First thing God tells him. The first rule that God gives man is that diet is not something that is without restriction. You can't eat everything, despite what some of us might try to do at a holiday table. You can't eat everything. Decisions must be made. God gives us some parameters that we must operate within in terms of food and diet. And that has been the case since the Garden of Eden. He says you can eat of every tree except the tree of knowledge of good and bad. Don't eat from that, because that will ultimately bring death. And you know the story, how it unfolds, but I want you to let this part sink in, that this is the rule in the garden. Did they have to wear a tzitzit on their garments? Did they have to, was that part of their outfit? No, we don't have any of those rules. We don't have any of those laws. We don't have any rules about, the proper slaying of an animal or anything like that. None of that plays in. You got one rule. As we say today, you have one job. You're going to till and keep the garden, which gives us sort of a drive that we should take in. A lot of biblical people don't think much about the environment, but in a way, it's what you're made for. People say, why did God create man? The answer a lot of people give is to worship him. Well, no. What he created man for was to till and to keep the garden, to serve and protect. That's your job. You have one job: serve and protect the garden that God made. That ought to drive us all to be environmental stewardesses. Stewards and stewardesses. Not all of us shouldn't be stewardesses. That's another class. So the idea, though, is that there is a boundary that we must function within in terms of that which we take into our bodies. Look with me at Genesis chapter 3. We'll go quickly through this. Now, the serpent was the shrewdest of all the wild beasts that the Lord God had made. And he said to the woman, now this in Hebrew is the Nakash. The Nakash says to the woman, did God really say, you shall not eat of any tree of the garden? And the woman replied to the serpent, we may eat of the fruit of the other trees of the garden. It's only about the fruit of the tree in the middle of the garden that God said, you shall not eat it or touch it lest you die. And the serpent said to the woman, you're not going to die. That's my serpent voice. But God knows that as soon as you eat of it, your eyes will be open and you will be like God who knows good and bad. When the woman saw the tree was good for eating and a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desirable as a source of wisdom, she took of its fruit and ate. She also gave some to her husband, and he ate too. And the eyes of both of them were open. They perceived that they were naked, and they sewed together fig leaves and made themselves loincloths. Now, I'm not getting into today, I know it's a hot topic, is Eve culpable? Did, some have argued that she wasn't even there. It's not the woman's fault. Some religious people say, well, the whole thing has gone off the rails because of women. You listen to your wife one time and then the whole world goes to hell in a handbasket. So some would argue that, and some would say, no, wait a minute. No, she wasn't even there when God told Adam that, so she can't be blamed. Look, they're both there. They both know the rule. They both eat of the fruit, and they are both ultimately banished from Gan Eden, from the garden, because of this. They violated a dietary rule, the only rule of the garden. And by the way, notice that they hide themselves. They put fig tree underwear on, which I wouldn't recommend. Fig leaves are itchy. And then they hide in the midst of the tree, singular in Hebrew, the tree of the garden. They're hiding in a fig tree. You have a fig tree? I have a fig tree in my yard. You can hide in the midst of the tree. Most translations will make that plural because they think, that makes sense. How are you going to hide in the middle of a tree? You're going to hide in the midst of trees, so they make it plural. But in the Hebrew, they're hiding in the fig tree, which is likely, this is me thinking, likely the fruit that they just ate. Yeah, I love figs. But were the figs the forbidden fruit? One thing that I try to eat one every day, some of you are probably going to say that can't be good. I try to eat one fig Newton every day. And I try harder to eat only one, because that's the challenge, right? But I'm serious. It does great for your body, I think. But figs are very, very healthy. Fig cakes are biblical. I started this some time back. King David ate figs, right? He ate fig cakes. King David ate fig Newtons. Go read 1 Samuel chapter 25. Remember Abigail? She has a foolish husband, and David and his men, they're famished. They want to rest. They want to get some food and some water. And remember, this fool says, I don't know who David, the son of Jesse, is. You can't. And then the wife, Abigail, hears about this, and she makes David some fig Newtons and brings them to him and the boys. So this is something you ought to think about. Also, another advantage to eating fig Newtons, this isn't a paid spot. I should be, but I'm not getting paid for this. But fig Newtons, they can restore life. Read 1 Samuel chapter 30, verses 9 through 12 or whatever. And it'll show you right there. So anyway, that's why I eat figs. But I think that it could have been a fig tree. Now, ultimately, Adam and Chava are cast out of Gan Eden because they violated a dietary restriction. Now remember, at the time, nobody is eating any flesh. God hadn't authorized that, and this is one of my points. Diet, from a biblical perspective, like many, many, many other things, changes over time. I know there are people who have stuck in their mind the verse where God says, I change not. I'm not talking about God changing. I'm talking about diet changing. Go with me to Genesis 9. Genesis chapter 9. And it says, verse 1, God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fertile and increase and fill the earth. The fear and the dread of you shall be upon all the beasts of the earth and upon all the birds of the sky, everything with which the earth is astir, and upon all the fish of the sea. They are given into your hand. Every creature that lives shall be yours to eat. As with the green grasses, I give you all these. Now, this is interesting because up until this point, they didn't eat flesh, but at this point, they are authorized to eat everything. Now, I know some of you are saying, wait a minute, no, only clean, Ross, clean, 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 not unclean. Well, I'm just going by what the text says. I know where people get this. They look at the priestly text in Genesis chapter 6 and 7. In chapter 7, look with me quickly at Genesis chapter 6, verse 20. Genesis 6:20, from birds of every kind, cattle of every kind of creeping thing on the earth, 2 of each shall come to you to stay alive. And so this idea is, this is what goes on the boat, two by two by two by two. But if you go to chapter 7, I'm not getting into sources at this point on this. We covered this some time back. But if you notice in chapter 7, look at verse 1. Then Jehovah, the Lord, said to Noah, go into the ark with all your household, for you alone have I found righteous before me in this generation. Of every clean, now remember he's already told him 2 of everything. Now he says, of every clean animal you shall take 7 pairs, males and their mates, and of every animal that is not clean, 2, a male and its mate. Of the birds of the sky also 7 pairs, male and female, to keep alive seed upon all the earth, etc. Now, question becomes, what is clean and unclean? Now, what a lot of people will do is they will superimpose what they know comes later into this era, E-R-A, into this period of time and suggest that Noah has a list like the handy document I posted on my academia page, where he knows that which is clean and that which is not clean. You can argue that, but there's no mention of clean and unclean prior to this. This is our first occurrence. And I'll let you do that which you wish on that front. But we do know that later, clearly later in the biblical text, particularly when we get to Vayikra, when we get to Leviticus, there are clearly distinctions made between that which is clean, animals, and that which is unclean, or pure and impure, however you would translate those. Now, later in the Bible, by that I mean Leviticus chapter 11 and Deuteronomy chapter 14. But again, listen to me, diet changes in the Bible. So someone need not be concerned that at an earlier stage, Ross suggested that at an earlier stage they didn't know what clean and unclean was. Look, at an earlier stage, they didn't even eat flesh at all. And then that it was permitted that certain things would be eaten. So diet changes. Get that. It's a fact. There are rules. You go from, there are certain kind of, in the Garden of Eden, there were fruits and greens that you could partake of, and there was one you couldn't, weren't allowed to. You could. I mean, you could, and they did, but they weren't supposed to. And it is the same which develops over biblical literature into what we now know as these lists. Now, here's one thing that is never, it hasn't changed yet, and that is in Genesis 9, verse 4. This is right after he says you can eat all the creatures. Verse 4, don't, however, eat flesh with its lifeblood in it. In other words, you can have the flesh of an animal, but you cannot, you're not allowed, you should not eat the blood. Okay, blood is sacred throughout the text. Go with me, I'll just give you a few more. Look at Leviticus chapter 17. Leviticus 17. And let's go to verse 10. Leviticus 17, verse 10. And I'll read a few verses here. If anyone of the house of Israel or of the strangers who reside among them partakes of any blood, I will set my face against the person who partakes of the blood, and I will cut him off from among his kin. For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have assigned it to you, excuse me, for making expiation for your lives upon the altar. It's the blood as life that affects expiation. Therefore I say to the Israelite people, no person among you shall partake of blood, nor shall the stranger who resides among you partake of blood. And if any Israelite or any stranger who resides among them hunts down an animal or a bird that may be eaten, he shall pour out its blood and cover it with the earth. For the life of all flesh is blood is its life. Therefore I say to the Israelite people, you shall not partake of the blood of any flesh, for the life of the flesh is its blood. Anyone who partakes of it shall be cut off. No blood. No blood. Don't take it. If somebody says, hey, you need to try this. This is really good. You say, what is it? Well, it's blood. You say, no, I'm not allowed. I shouldn't have to tell you that, but I am, because it's not allowed. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 26. 19:26a, I should say, just the first part of that verse. You shall not eat anything with its blood. This is part of the holiness code. It is a list of laws that scholars call the holiness code, and this statement is part of what is referred to as the holiness code. Now look with me at Deuteronomy chapter 12. I want to go through a few more verses here. Deuteronomy chapter 12 and verse 23. 12:23 says, but make sure that you do not partake of the blood, for the blood is the life. And you must not consume the life with the flesh. You must not partake of it. You must pour it out on the ground like water. You must not partake of it in order that it may go well with you and with your descendants to come, for you will be doing what is right in the sight of the Lord. What we have lost in our day and age, in our culture, is any reverence for the life of the animal that we consume. The Bible does authorize humans to partake of animal flesh, but we've lost because we go to the market and we purchase, it's in a nice package, and we don't think about the life of the animal that we're buying. Now, a lot of people who listen to me might hunt. You have an opportunity to do this, this idea that you respect the life. The Native Americans are a good example. I've read that when they would take the life of an animal, they recognized that it was only an exchange for their own sustenance, that they had respect, that the blood was treated with reverence. We get this idea, I don't think it's just human blood, we get the idea when Cain kills Abel that God says, I hear your brother's blood crying to me from the ground. Why? Because it was taken in a vicious way. And there was no reverence, there was no respect. It was murder, right? So the idea is that there is life. Life is in this substance. And I'm not scientific enough to know just how accurate that statement could be, but I think it's more than just a matter of words to say that. So we have to think about that. But in these passages, there is a respect for the life of the animal. Okay. When people talk about food and diet from a biblical perspective, they often do so using a certain word. How many of you have ever heard the word kosher? You know the word kosher? Everybody heard the word kosher? Yeah, well, guess what? It's not a biblical word. So, You know, people talk about the biblical diet. I've even said this myself. You go, well, Ross, do you eat according to the rules of kashrut? You know, I meet some of my Jewish friends, and they think, golly, you're kind of like a Jew, but you're just not Jewish. So how far have you taken this thing? And I say, I go biblically kosher. You know, I'll say that. But I use that term. But here's the deal. Kosher, in Hebrew, the three-letter root, kaf, shin, resh, is not found in any text dealing with the Bible. I mean with biblical diet. It is used 6 times. That root is used 6 times in the Bible. Once in Exodus, in Esther, not Exodus, in Esther chapter 8, verse 5, and 5 times in Ecclesiastes. And that's it. 6 times. None of those passages have anything to do with diet. So here are the references. I know that Baruch will write these down for you. You can write them too. Esther 8:5, then Ecclesiastes 2:21, 4:4, 5:10, 10:10, and 11:6. Ecclesiastes, Esther and Ecclesiastes. Now, in each of those, it's translated differently, variously in those passages. But if you look up, use a good lexicon, or you can use Blue Letter Bible, maybe might give you this too. You don't have to have the reference works I have. I just looked at how messy my area is there. You guys, I'm sorry. But I ran out of time. But if you look up in Halot, the Hebrew Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament, you look up the root kaf shin resh, and what you get is that it means right or proper, generally, right or proper. We do this today, like somebody says, hey, can you do such and such? And I might say, is that even kosher? You know, it means, is it right? Can I do that? Is that proper to do? Is that kosher? Even people who don't know anything about God or the Bible, it has come into our culture. We know that kosher means right. That's kosher, right? Right? Is that proper? The rabbis in rabbinic literature took this word in. If you use Jastro's dictionary, which gives you every occurrence in like rabbinic literature, or it seems to, it's very, very good. And it shows all the places in Talmudic literature, in the Mishnah and so forth, where the word kosher is used. And that idea, it's used exclusively to mean right and proper, and it does tie with diet. Particularly in the Targums, we find the usage of the root word kosher associated with the diet. Remember, the Targums are a translation of the Hebrew into, say, Aramaic or whatever, and so they use that word kosher. It's a rabbinic word. Okay. Now, there is a Hebrew word that ties to diet and eating that you know as well. It's another Hebrew word, and it has to do with eating the right things which are killed in the right way, and it's associated with the priestly definition of holiness, So go with me. Let me give you these 4 for your notes. Exodus chapter 22. I'm going to tie diet, something about a diet, with holiness. Chapter 22, verse 30. Verse 31 in an English Bible, I think. You shall be holy people to me. You must not eat flesh torn by beast in the field. You shall cast it to the dogs. Okay, so there is an association, at least, but work with me here, with holiness and some aspect of what you can or cannot or should not put into your mouth and into your gachon. Everybody learn that word today, gachon. Gachon, your belly, in your belly. Look at Leviticus 11. Leviticus 11, verse 44. For I, the Lord, am your God. You shall sanctify yourselves and be holy, for I am holy. You shall not make yourselves unclean through any swarming thing that moves upon the earth. For I, The Lord am he who brought you up from the land of Egypt to be your God. You shall be holy, for I am holy. Now I want you to notice something. Put this in your notes. We're going to come back to this. Notice that in Leviticus 11, verse 44, there is a connection between you eating something unclean and you becoming unclean. That's a priestly idea. I wonder if Deuteronomy says anything like that. Stick with me. Go to chapter 20 of Leviticus. In this priestly book here, in chapter 20 of Leviticus, verse 22, you shall faithfully observe all my laws and all my regulations, lest the land to which I bring you to settle in spew you out. You shall not follow the practices of the nation that I'm driving out before you, for it is because they did all these things that I abhorred them and said to you, you shall possess their land, for I will give it to you to possess, a land flowing with milk and honey. I, the Lord, am your God, who has set you up apart from other people. So you shall set apart the clean beast from the unclean bird from the clean. You shall not draw abomination upon yourselves through beast or bird or anything with which the ground is alive, which I have set apart for you to treat as unclean. You shall be holy to me, for I, the Lord, am holy and have set you apart from other people to be mine. Notice again, Leviticus has it clear that there is an association between holiness and diet or food, but there's also, you can be unclean by something that goes in. Deuteronomy chapter 14. Deuteronomy chapter 14 and verse 21. You shall not eat anything that has died a natural death. Give it to the stranger in your community to eat. Or you may sell it to a foreigner. For you're holy people, you're a people consecrated to the Lord your God. You shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. Now, interestingly enough, I need you, says this text, to be holy. Don't eat, a lot of people, and I'm not trying to be crude, but people talk about roadkill. Like if you found something that was hit, I know some of you people in Louisiana are saying, what's wrong with that? But if something dies of itself, or if you find something dead already, you're not supposed to eat it. But according to Deuteronomy 14, give it to a foreigner. They can eat it. You can just scratch a note and put it in your Bible and say, give it to a Cajun. They'll eat it. Okay. I can say that. You can't. Failure, what we have, though, is an association biblically between piety and diet. Holiness and that which you take in, according to priestly writers, is connected. Also connected, according to the priestly pen, is that a failure to follow the rules yields negative consequences. If a person eats animal flesh, there are some of these animals that are considered acceptable, approved, and some that are forbidden. They're clean and unclean, pure and impure. Now look at my chart. Now, I'm not going to go through this line by line, word by word, letter by letter. This is for your study, but I do want to point out a couple of things. What I've done here is as I've done in other horizontal studies. What we have biblically is we have Leviticus 11 gives a priestly listing of that which is good and that which is not good to eat. And I'm talking animals. Now, let me put it this way. Leviticus says, these are the living things, chayot, that you may eat. The synoptic text in Deuteronomy, meaning the same text in Deuteronomy, doesn't say these are the living things you may eat. It says these are the animals that you can eat. Bahema. So you have chayot and bahema, but the idea is that you have, here's what you can eat. What are you talking about? Living things like animals, So they word it differently, but they're different sources. Different sources give us different writings, and they tell the same basic story. But if you you study this, and this is your Sabbath study sheet today. Go through and look at line by line every one of these things, and you'll see where they differ and how they differ. What's interesting is that Leviticus, even though they're almost, they contain the same list basically, but Leviticus tends to add. You know, like Leviticus will say, Deuteronomy says you're not supposed to eat a camel. Well, Leviticus says a camel. You're not supposed to eat a camel. That's what Deuteronomy said. But Leviticus says, because it chews the cud but does not part the hoof, it is unclean to you. Deuteronomy just says don't eat a camel. Right? Well, it's already, Deuteronomy seems to think, I just told you that if something parts the hoof and chews the cud, it's good. I don't have to tell you not the camel, because the idea that Deuteronomy gives you is look at a camel. Look at the feet, look at the eat. That's the way you tell on an animal. Look at the feet, look at the eat. That's all you need to know. The rule is the rule. Now, Leviticus, though, goes into greater detail. It's like a training manual for priests. And I believe it's later. But that's another discussion. But if you look at side by side on my chart, you'll notice on page 1 that Leviticus says towards the top, these are living things you may eat among all the animals that are on the earth. Deuteronomy says these are the animals you may eat. And then it gives you some. The ox, the sheep, the goat, the deer, the gazelle, the roebuck, the wild goat, the ibex, the antelope, and the mountain sheep. Leviticus doesn't give you that. It's like, here are the animals that you'll need to know. Now, according to the rule, by the way, if you look at the feet and you look at the eat, you look at what makes an animal kosher, the split hoof chews the cud. You can eat a giraffe. A giraffe is kosher. Now, I don't think you should, but according to the rules. Now, they didn't have to worry about a lot of giraffes in the desert nor in the land of Israel. I mean, I've been over there a lot. I've never seen, I didn't go to the zoo. I'm sure they have one in their zoo, but it's not native, but it does fit. Now, there's a big debate. There's a big discussion on, yeah, but a giraffe has a 6-foot neck. So where do you cut if you have to sacrifice? Or if you have to kill to eat, where would you cut the giraffe? The top, in the middle, or the bottom? And the counter to that is, well, you're stupid. You don't know anything about proper slaughter methods if you have to ask that question. It's the same. It doesn't matter how long the neck is. This is the idea. But anyway, I just want you to understand that by the rules, that's all that matters. If you know that, you know that. The lists are basically the same. You'll notice that the list begins with the beast or the living things, and like the list I give you from Deuteronomy. We're talking about sheep, oxen, that kind of thing. This is what we're talking about. And then the list tells you what you can't eat. Okay? Deuteronomy and Leviticus. Notice that where they are the same, they deviate very little. So, for instance, as you study this, you'll notice that hare, H-A-R-E, is in a different place between Leviticus and Deuteronomy. But otherwise, all of these are basically, you can run through them and look side by side. By the way, in the South, I've heard hunters say this about rabbit. By the way, they don't follow kosher here at all. Like just maybe the people in this room. Most people don't. But here's the deal. You hear a lot of old timers. These guys have been hunting forever. And they'll say, the only time you can eat a rabbit is months that have an R in it. January, February, March, April, not May, not June, not July, not August, September. Yeah, you can eat it. October, November, December. Why? Because in those warmer months, they have worms in their flesh. Well, God doesn't tell you all that. He just says, don't eat the hare. Right? The rock badger, because they chew the cud but don't part the hoof. They're unclean for you, see? The pig, it parts the hoof but does not chew the cud. It's unclean. You're not even supposed to touch their flesh. So the Bible not only gives you the rule that look at the eat and look at the feet. Look at how they eat. Do they chew the cud? Do they have split hoofs? If they chew the cud but don't have a split hoof, you can't eat it. If they have a split hoof but don't chew, you got to have both. And then we get into water, aquatic. Water is next. Now there's an easy rule for the water. Anything that lives full or part-time in the water, guess what? You have to have fins and scales. Not one or the other. Like, again, I use my dear Cajun friends here, anybody in the South pretty much. I guess it's this way everywhere, but particularly here. This area is known for its unkosher cuisine, right? And it really is. And catfish, no, why? Catfish have fins but not scales. You can't eat catfish. I mean, you can, you shouldn't, according to the biblical diet. Crawfish, no, can't have it. What about shrimp? How about oysters? Man, raw oysters, smoked oysters, fried oyster po' boy. Sorry, folks, can't have it. Crabs, soft shell crabs, deep fried in Cajun seasoning. No, can't have it. Clams, you have to have fins and scales. Not fins without scales, not scales without fins. You have to have fins and scales. That also rules out amphibious things which live full or part-time. You know, you can't have alligator, although that's a delicacy here at you can get it as an appetizer. In fact, when people come for the conference, if you come, when you go to the restaurants locally, we're going to have food here for you quite a bit, and that's all good to go. But if you go to a restaurant and they offer you a stuffed potato or something like that, you always have to say, what's it stuffed with? That's a good question, because they don't count off like bacon is not called meat here. You know, they'll bring you something with bacon, and you'll say, well, I told you I didn't eat meat. They'll say, well, I didn't know bacon was meat or something. They're not that bad, but it's pretty bad. By the way, you can't have frog legs either. Lobster, not on the list. Now, a lot of people try to get around. They like this kind of stuff, so they make loopholes. But a biblical diet, food that comes out of the water, anything that lives in the water, full or part-time, has to have fins and scales or it's unclean. What about airfowl? This is a little bit tougher. Fowl or things that fly, birds, if you will, are a little bit tougher, and they're listed by name. So there's no rule like feathers with a tuft on the head or anything like that you can go by. In fact, there are debates even today. Some argue that you shouldn't eat chicken. Those are probably people who own chickens like me. When you watch them eat, you're like, I don't know. But the idea is that birds, we have a list, but some of the species that are listed, it's a little bit, they're debated. We don't know what these are. Now, if you look at the English translation I just used ESV because I think it's a good translation. But under the birds, it says eagle, the bearded vulture, the black vulture, the kite, the falcon of any kind, every raven of any kind, ostrich, nighthawk, seagull, hawk of any kind, the little owl, short-eared owl, barn owl, tawny owl, the carrion vulture, and the cormorant, the stork, the heron, the hoopie, and the bat. Don't eat bats, coronavirus kind of stuff. Anyway, so the idea, though, is that we don't know for sure some of these that are listed. We just don't know. And so you have to exercise caution on those kind of things. Now, from the air and the fowl, we get into winged insects. Now, I want you to look, if you did print this out, page 2 has almost a little over halfway down. Leviticus says, yet among the winged insects, all winged insects that go on all fours are detestable to you. Deuteronomy says, all winged insects are unclean for you, they shall not be eaten. All winged insects. Doesn't say anything about going on all fours or detestable. It just says all winged insects shall not be eaten. But Leviticus says, let me tell you what you can eat. Among the winged insects that go on all four, Deuteronomy doesn't know this, you can eat those that have jointed legs above their feet, with which to hop on the ground. You may eat the locust of any kind, the bald locust of any kind, the cricket of any kind, the grasshopper of any kind, should you want to, by the way. If you follow Leviticus's rules, you can go out and gobble up a grasshopper. But all the winged insects that have 4 feet are detestable to you. So you got to be careful, though. You know, you're looking at something that has jointed legs and 4 feet, and you know, it gets a little complicated as to which grasshopper you can eat, should you choose to do so. I know that some people have done videos where they eat these things, but there is debate. You know, are they eating something clean? And another question is, are they sane to do this? But that's another question. Okay, now Leviticus goes on and on. There are things that Deuteronomy doesn't have anything in its list about. Notice in my chart, it goes into quite a bit of detail. Leviticus does some repetition there. Now, here's something Leviticus says that Deuteronomy doesn't have. All that walk on their paws among animals that go on all fours are unclean to you. Would that be like a bear, maybe? And it walk on all fours? So are you supposed to eat dog? It goes on all 4 paws, right? Okay, anyway, so it goes through that, and then it gets into other things that are unclean to you, swarming things that swarm the ground, the mole rat, the mouse, the great lizard of any kind, the gecko, the monitor lizard, the sand lizard, the chameleon, and it goes on and on. Look, when I read this, have you ever thought about this? Like, I understand if you're starving, but imagine the first person that's sitting on his porch and he sees a pig and he says, I'm going to eat that. What would make someone say, this animal that is rolling in the squalor, I'm going to eat that? Or what? See, but somebody, you have to say, because somebody would eat a gecko, right? You go through this list and it goes on about the details, but notice one thing, again, that Leviticus covers quite a bit, that it says over and over, is that you can get unclean by taking unclean beasts and eating them. Deuteronomy doesn't have any of that. If you read Leviticus, you get the idea that what goes into the mouth can defile you. But if you read only Deuteronomy, you could say something like, it's not what goes into the mouth that defiles you. Because Deuteronomy doesn't have that list. I'll let y'all think about that for a minute. Okay. Go with me to Ezekiel chapter 4. Ezekiel chapter 4. I hope you did catch that. That was pretty good. I like that. Ezekiel 4:14. Now this, by the way, is an interesting story. I've heard people say, in fact, in my local grocery store, they have Ezekiel bread. You can buy Ezekiel bread. And it's fun because I like Ezekiel bread, but I also know the biblical story. And if you know the biblical story, you know, or you hope, that they didn't make it like Ezekiel bread. Now, Ezekiel bread in Ezekiel he is to pantomime, he's to act this out where he's on one side and then on another, and he's going to eat this bread. And he says, verse 12, Ezekiel 4, Eat it as a barley cake, you shall make it on human dung before their eyes. So you're going to take this bread and cook it in human dung. That's the way Ezekiel bread's got to be made if you want to do it by the biblical way. So read your label in your store before you buy this stuff. So, verse 13, said the Lord, shall the people of Israel eat their bread, unclean among the nations to which I'll banish them. And then Ezekiel says this. It says, then I said, Lord God, my person has never defiled, nor have I ever eaten anything that died of itself or was torn by beast from my youth until now, nor has foul flesh entered my mouth. He's like, I have never eaten anything defiling in my life, and you're telling me to eat my bread cooked on human dung. And it says, and he answered me, see, I allow you cow dung instead of human excrement. Go prepare your bread on that. Now, if I were Ezekiel, I'd say, well, it's the dung part that I don't, particularly like. Can I maybe use sticks or something to warm it? Anyway, Ezekiel brings across this idea that that which goes into a person can defile. Ezekiel, the son of the priest, Ezekiel is a priest. So if you go through and you continue to work through Leviticus 11, Leviticus 11 goes into other things, this idea of something that's died of itself. Deuteronomy has that too, just in a briefer way. But Deuteronomy does add that you can give this to a foreigner or to a sojourner with you. So they have different rules. I know a lot of people say, well, but it says that the same laws apply for the most part, but this is one of the exceptions. Like they can eat. In fact, most rabbis will say if you're not Jewish, they have two categories, Jew, non-Jew. If you're a non-Jew, eat whatever you want. You can, and you should, just live it up. But if you're biblically oriented, you want to follow these things. So if somebody said, hey, look, I found this possum on the side of the road, and I'm being a little bit light, but this really happens here. Would you like it? And they say, a lot of people say, well, yeah, I'll take that. But that's against the Bible. You can't do that. Unless, it says, though, a sojourner or foreigner can. Now, then it gets into swarming things that swarm. Basically only in Leviticus. Deuteronomy basically says all of these swarming things are unclean. Look at it. You study it. You make sure I'm right on that. Deuteronomy 14 ends with, don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. Now that particular commandment is listed in 3 places in the Bible. Here in Deuteronomy 14:21, but it's also in Exodus 23:19 and Exodus 34, verse 26. Now, don't kill a kid in its mother's milk. We know from the ancient Near East that there were certain cultic practices where this literally took place. I've read papers on this. But it was taken, fences built around it, and it was turned into the rabbinic injunction to not mix dairy and meat. And this has become a major stay in kashrut, in the laws of kashrut. If you have Jewish friends, or if you're listening and you're Jewish and you follow the rules of kashrut, a lot of you will have separate dishes, separate spaces in the kitchen, different refrigerators, different silverware, to keep an accurate handle on this and to make sure that you don't mix meat and dairy. And there's a lot of different opinions on this, but the bottom line is a lot of people will say it has to do with mixing life and death. If you think about it, milk represents nourishment and life for a baby, and the blood represents death. So you don't mix the dead meat with the life-giving substance of milk. So in that way I can understand where they're coming from. But according to the Bible, and there's people that try to make excuses for this, but in Genesis 18:7-8, if we believe that God shows up to Abraham's tent, Abraham makes something that is not kosher according to later Jewish law. Now, I know people say, well, they had to wait 30 minutes between the time they had the meat and the milk, but it doesn't say that. So it's a problem. But you have Abraham prepares this kid in milk, basically. So that's a problem. course, then you also have Psalm 50, verse 12 and 13, where God says, look, if I were hungry, I wouldn't ask you, do I drink blood? Do I eat the flesh of bulls and goats? No, I don't. So that's another question. There are other rules associated with eating flesh. In Genesis 32 and 33, chapter 32, verse 32 and 33, Jacob wrestles with this opponent, and he's touched on the thigh. And because of that, we read in a text clearly written much later that this is the reason. See, Jacob limped because of his sciatic nerve damage, and it says for this reason we don't eat that sciatic nerve, okay? Well, to this day. See, that's written much later into the text, but it did become a rule. There's also in Leviticus 3, verses 16 and 17, certain fat that is not allowed into the diet, and it's chalev, and it's typically associated with the fat around the entrails and around the kidneys and so forth. Now look, a biblical diet does not and cannot make you holy. I want you to understand that. In fact, there is not a diet that of any kind that can make you holy. Now, what does that mean, really? The first thing I'll do is make sure you get that. You can eat all the right things, killed in all the right ways, and that does not make you holy. So the question I would have is, could eating the wrong things, killed the wrong way, make you unclean? Now, some of you are thinking, well, wait a minute now. Leviticus 11 says that. I want you to just think. If it can make you holy to eat the right things, that's one thing. But if it can't, then can the opposite effect be there? Now, let me keep going. To be holy, though, if you choose to be holy as you're commanded to be holy, you should seek to eat that which is approved and associated with the holiness diet. Eating those things doesn't make you holy, but to be holy, you must attempt to reform your diet to the biblical standards. Per Leviticus 11, these unclean animals can make you unclean. They are an abomination. Deuteronomy also in the English says abomination, but it's a different word, and it doesn't associate you becoming an abomination by eating unclean things. But whatever you eat, whatever your diet is, I want you to avoid the forbidden, and I want you to avoid blood. Now, how do you do that? I mean, totally. Make good and healthy food choices. And I'll say this, don't defile yourself by what goes in your mouth. But I want you to also work on don't defile yourself by what comes out. Shabbat Shalom. Join me next week, same time, same social media platforms, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, or wait and download the podcast. Either way. Shabbat Shalom. Have a beautiful week.